Deep within the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where fog drapes the valleys like a shroud and silence presses heavier than any scream, there lived a family whose blood had turned inward, against itself. This is the story of Martha May Collier, a woman whose womb seemed to harbor death itself, whose children entered the world already marked by tragedy. It was 1947. The world beyond the mountains had begun to rebuild after the devastation of World War II, yet in the remote Appalachian valleys, time moved differently, slower, heavier. The Collier family had occupied the same hollow for 5 generations, isolated by choice and by geography. The nearest town, Harland, lay 23 miles away, a journey over treacherous ridges and winter-choked roads that often became impassable. The Colliers seldom ventured beyond their land. They needed nothing from the outside. Within their boundaries, life provided itself up a creek for water, fields for crops, and each other for companionship. Martha May was born in 1929 to Ezekiel and Sarah Collier, the youngest of 7 children, though only 4 survived beyond infancy. Her childhood was a rhythm of solitude and ritual. The family spoke a language all their own, a peculiar mix of archaic English and invented words that outsiders could barely understand. They knew no schools, no doctors, only the mountain and each other. At 16, in 1945, Martha May's father arranged her marriage to her first cousin, Thomas Collier. In the hollow, such unions were ordinary. Generations of Colliers had intermarried. Ezekiel himself had married his uncle's daughter, his father had taken his niece as a wife. Their family tree had long since ceased branching outward, twisting instead back upon itself until roots and limbs were inseparable, a tangled knot of repeating names and shared blood. Thomas was 24, quiet, with a pronounced limp. His narrow skull set his eyes too far apart, and a cleft palate made his speech difficult. His hands trembled constantly, worsening with age. Yet in the Collier family, such deformities were not warnings, they were simply marks of the lineage, normal variations in an unnatural history. The couple lived in a cabin built by Thomas's grandfather, a structure leaning slightly to one side, cold air slipping through cracks in the walls. Furniture was crude but functional, a single fireplace provided warmth and a place to cook. There was no electricity, no running water, no connection to the world beyond their ridge, save for rare trips into town to trade for supplies. In the spring of 1946, Martha May became pregnant at 17. The early months brought relentless nausea and exhaustion, confining her to bed for weeks. Her mother, Sarah, tended her with remedies passed down through generations, teas from roots, poultices pressed against her swelling belly, prayers whispered into the darkness. By January 1947, labor began. 36 hours later, a boy emerged, Ezekiel Jr. alive, yet grotesquely malformed. His skull was misshapen, elongated, compressed to one side. His eyes bulged, unable to close fully, his twisted arms bent at unnatural angles. His skin was gray, as if life itself were draining from him. He made no sound, breathed in shallow, rapid gasps, his tiny chest heaving. Martha May held him for 3 days, watching as he faded into stillness. He never nursed. He never cried. On the 4th day, he was gone, and they buried him behind the cabin, in soil so frozen that breaking the earth was nearly impossible. Within months, Martha May conceived again. By spring 1948, she delivered a girl named Sarah. The child's deformities were more pronounced. Her spine curved sharply, forming a hump, one leg was shorter, ending in a clubfoot. Her jaw protruded, leaving her mouth unable to close. Drool leaked continuously. Unlike her brother, Sarah lived, but never thrived. She never smiled, never cooed, never reached developmental milestones, though her eyes tracked movement with quiet awareness. She simply existed. Martha May cared for her as best she could, feeding her with cloths soaked in milk, unable to nurse her naturally. Thomas carved a cradle that accommodated her twisted body. Their love was practical, protective, a devotion to a fragile, broken life. In 1949, another pregnancy brought Thomas Jr., born early 1950. Fluid-filled, his skull expanded grotesquely, his eyes were forced to the sides of his head. His tiny chest heaved, and seizures racked his small frame. He lived only 2 weeks. With each loss, Martha May's endurance frayed further. By 21, she had buried 2 children and cared for 1 permanently disabled infant. The other women of the hollow whispered that she was cursed, that her womb carried death. Yet the truth was neither mystical nor divine. It was mathematics, a cruel, unfeeling calculus written in blood, manifesting as genetic collapse. Recessive mutations, harmless when paired with a normal gene, compounded over generations of cousin marriages. The Colliers had narrowed their genetic pool over 5 generations, concentrating harmful genes until each child became a reflection of their ancestry's repeating mistakes. By 1951, Martha May had given birth 6 times, 3 children dead, 3 surviving with varying deformities. Sarah remained infant-sized at 3. Jacob, born late 1950, survived but was functionally blind and deaf, his jaw malformed. Rebecca, born 1951, survived only 11 days, her organs exposed through an incomplete abdominal wall. Each pregnancy ravaged Martha May. Her teeth fell, hair thinned, eyes hollowed, her 22-year-old body resembled that of a woman decades older. Thomas, growing increasingly frustrated and helpless, labored in the fields from dawn to dusk. His own body deteriorated, tremors spreading from hands to arms to legs, speech slowed by weakening facial muscles. The Colliers became an object of avoidance in the hollow. Outsiders, superstitious and fearful, whispered of curses and divine punishment, never suspecting that science, not sin, had claimed them. In winter 1952, Martha May's 7th pregnancy brought another stillborn son. Hypertrichosis covered his body, his spine was exposed, organs malformed. She did not attend the burial, lying numb in her bed, recognizing instinctively that her womb had become a place of death. By 1953, Martha May, now 24, was pregnant yet again. Her surviving children required constant care, her body a battlefield of exhaustion, grief, and physical decay. Outside intervention was minimal, church members left food on the porch, reluctant to enter. Whispers continued, warnings of bloodlines turned inward. Finally, in late 1953, Mrs. Hester of the local general store contacted Dr. Coleman, a circuit-riding physician. He arrived in November, unprepared for the horror within the Collier cabin. Sarah, twisted and infantile at 5.5, Jacob, blind and deaf, and a new infant sat in silent, grotesque tableaus of suffering. Martha May, pale, hollow-eyed, and 7 months pregnant with her 9th child, seemed a living corpse. Dr. Coleman's examination revealed a pattern unmistakable in its precision, systematic genetic collapse. This was no accident, no curse, it was the arithmetic of inbreeding, the cruel inevitability of repeated cousin marriages over generations. He attempted to explain the science gently. Your blood is too similar, he said. It's like mixing the same paint over and over, it gets muddier each time. Thomas understood nothing. Martha May, too exhausted, nodded without comprehension. Dr. Coleman recommended ending the cycle, no more children, but the Colliers' worldview offered no means of considering such intervention. Children were blessings, not choices. He documented everything and submitted his report to the state health department, yet bureaucracy offered no immediate relief. By the fall of 1954, Martha May, now 25, was pregnant for the 8th time. Sarah, still trapped in her infant body at 7, required constant attention. Jacob, blind and deaf, relied on touch to navigate his world. His malformed jaw making every feeding agonizing. The newest child, Daniel, was born in March 1953, his face grotesquely asymmetrical, one side drooping, soft spots pulsing visibly with every heartbeat. Fluid in his lungs made a wet, gurgling sound, and his breathing never came easily. He survived only 6 months, and with his death came a sense of bitter relief for Martha May, exhausted beyond measure, existing only through instinct and obligation. The Hollow community's reaction to the Colliers was a strange mixture of charity and fear. Church members left food or clothing on the porch, careful to avoid direct interaction, as though proximity might transmit some unseen contagion. Whispers filled the valleys. What happens when blood turns inward? When families become too close, what horrors are born? Superstition cloaked terror in vague moral judgment. But no deity had cursed the Colliers. The destruction was systematic, cruel, and entirely natural, an unyielding consequence of compounded genetics. In late 1953, Mrs. Hester, the elderly storekeeper from Harland, finally acted. She contacted Dr. Coleman, urging him to witness the Collier household firsthand. The physician arrived in November, his experience with poverty, neglect, and Appalachian suffering extensive, but the cabin that day tested even his seasoned nerves. Inside, Sarah lay twisted in her cradle, eyes tracking movement but otherwise motionless. Jacob rocked in a corner, his face grotesque, jaw deformed, hands trembling. A younger girl, born earlier that year, slumped against the wall, drool pooling on her dress. Martha May herself seemed near death, her skin grey and mottled, hair thin and greasy, eyes sunken hollows of exhaustion. 7 months pregnant with her 9th child, she was a ghost of herself. Dr. Coleman documented everything meticulously, photographing, measuring, recording symptoms. The pattern was unmistakable, these were not random birth defects. The Colliers were experiencing the collapse of a genetically isolated lineage. He explained carefully to Thomas and Martha May, in words stripped of jargon, "Your blood is too similar." When close relatives have children, harmful genes double up. It's like mixing paint repeatedly, it gets darker, muddier, until the color itself becomes toxic. Thomas, unsurprisingly, comprehended nothing. Martha May, too worn to question or argue, simply nodded. The advice, stop having children, was foreign, impossible. The Colliers' worldview did not accommodate choice in reproduction. Children were gifts, blessings from God, not matters for negotiation. Coleman left, submitting his report to the state in Frankfurt, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and the mountain remained untouched. In January 1954, Martha May gave birth to her 9th child, a girl named Martha Jr. She was tiny, her head severely underdeveloped, microcephalic, eyes wide-set, unfocused. She wailed only a shrill, constant whine. She would never walk, speak, or recognize her mother. By now, Martha May had abandoned hope. Names were labels for bodies, not vessels for life or potential. She moved mechanically, feeding, cleaning, burying, repeating. Each birth was both ritual and ordeal, each loss a quiet, numbing devastation. The year 1954 offered no reprieve. By June, Dr. Helen Pritchard, a researcher at the University of Kentucky studying isolated hereditary conditions, read Coleman's report. She saw in the Colliers a rare, horrifying case. Sustained inbreeding had created a laboratory of human suffering. She requested and gained permission to visit, accompanied by Dr. Robert Chun, a pediatric specialist. They arrived in June with cameras, measurement tools, and recording equipment. The Colliers were wary, unaccustomed to outsiders, suspicious of intentions. Martha May, visibly deteriorated, allowed the examination. Over 3 days, the doctors documented 6 living children, from 6 months to 7 years. They measured limbs, skulls, and developmental markers. They photographed deformities from every angle, recorded breathing, and mapped every physical abnormality. Interviews with Martha May and Thomas revealed a family history of intermarriage stretching back generations. Great-grandparents married great-aunts, grandparents married first cousins, parents married their uncles' daughters. The genealogy was devastating in its clarity. Dr. Pritchard calculated that Martha May and Thomas shared roughly 37.5% of their DNA, a level far exceeding the 12.5% typical of first cousins, thanks to generations of repeated cousin marriages. Their children were almost certain to inherit 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. The medical team identified 12 distinct disorders across the children: cleft palate, clubfoot, microcephaly, malformed jaws, spinal deformities, and syndromes usually seen only in extreme isolation. Some children exhibited multiple disorders simultaneously, compounding suffering. Sarah, now 7, remained at the physical and cognitive level of a 3-month-old. Jacob's blindness, deafness, and jaw deformity condemned him to total care. The younger children displayed even more severe impairments, and the prognosis was grim. None were likely to survive beyond 15, most would die much sooner. On the 3rd day, Dr. Pritchard spoke gently with Martha May. "Your children are dying because of the family marriages," she explained. "When relatives have children together, harmful genes double up. These things cannot be fixed." Martha May listened quietly, her expression a map of exhaustion and resignation. "I know," she whispered. "I've known since Sarah. I can feel it from the start. Something is wrong inside me. But what can I do? This is my family. This is my husband. I cannot leave." The tragedy of Martha May was not just biological, it was cultural, social, and geographical. She was trapped by the mountains, by poverty, by tradition, by love, by duty. Leaving was unthinkable. She could no more escape than she could stop breathing. Dr. Pritchard recommended immediate intervention. The surviving children should be placed in specialized care. Martha May should receive medical attention to prevent further pregnancies. Thomas should be counseled about genetic risks, and the family ideally relocated to a less isolated community. The authorities did nothing. The Colliers were not neglectful in the legal sense. They provided food, shelter, and care to the best of their ability. Intervention required proof of immediate danger or abuse, and none existed in the bureaucratic eyes. Despite this, Pritchard's documentation would become foundational in medical literature. Boxes of photographs, measurements, and notes left the hollow, later published in 1955 in the Journal of Medical Genetics. Her study, titled Genetic Consequences of Extended Consanguinity in an Isolated Mountain Population, became a landmark reference for inbreeding research. But for Martha May, the world beyond the mountains offered no relief. By fall 1954, she was pregnant again, her 10th child. By May 1955, Martha May Collier, now 26, gave birth to her 10th child, another boy, named Ezekiel III after his grandfather and the first lost son. From the moment he emerged, his condition confirmed every fear Dr. Pritchard had predicted. His bones were impossibly fragile, the very act of birth fractured ribs and limbs. His translucent skin revealed the structure beneath, veins tracing like dark rivers. His skull was soft, collapsing slightly under the slightest pressure. Martha May cradled him constantly, afraid that any movement might shatter his delicate frame. She fed him with drops of milk, watching each shallow, fragile breath, anticipating the inevitable. Ezekiel III survived only 18 days. By the end, Martha May was numb. Grief had long since been exhausted, tears had dried, worn out by a decade of burial, of endless care for children trapped in bodies that could not thrive. Her youth had been devoured, her body battered by 10 consecutive pregnancies, 5 of them ending in early death, the others leaving children permanently disabled. Her physical decline was catastrophic. Bones weakened by repeated pregnancies and malnutrition, teeth crumbling, making eating a painful ordeal, her uterus prolapsing, causing chronic pain and bleeding. In August 1955, she collapsed while tending the garden. Thomas found her lying on the earth, conscious but unable to rise. He carried her inside and sent word to Mrs. Hester, who contacted Dr. Coleman. When Coleman arrived 2 days later, his diagnosis was blunt: Martha May's body was shutting down. Years of malnutrition, relentless pregnancies, and the physical and emotional toll of caring for severely disabled children had pushed her to the brink. He insisted she be transported over 100 miles to a hospital in Lexington. Thomas initially resisted, concerned for cost and disruption, but the doctor was unyielding. If she remained, she would not survive a month. Martha May spent 6 weeks in the hospital, treated for severe anemia, infections, malnutrition, and the accumulated damage of repeated childbirth. Doctors also performed procedures to prevent further pregnancies, a paternalistic intervention, executed without fully informing her, reflecting both the era and the urgency of her survival. When she returned to the Hollow in October 1955, she discovered that Martha Jr., born with microcephaly 16 months earlier, had died in her absence, claimed by pneumonia. She buried her alongside her other children, standing at the graves with an empty, unfeeling gaze. The capacity for grief had been consumed, exhausted by years of continuous suffering. The following years unfolded as a slow, relentless decline rather than a series of dramatic events. Sarah died in 1958 at age 10, her fragile body finally succumbing after a decade of minimal functioning. Jacob survived until 1961, dying at 11 from complications linked to his multiple deformities. One by one, the other children followed, none reaching adolescence. Each death carried both tragedy and grim relief, a release from suffering, a slight reduction in the overwhelming burden Martha May bore. By 1965, every one of Martha May's children had perished. 10 pregnancies had produced 10 children, 10 lives had ended either in infancy or early childhood. The wooden crosses behind the cabin marked the entirety of her reproductive life, a decade of relentless pregnancy, loss, and care that had devoured her youth and destroyed her health. Thomas Collier died in 1967 at 46. Years of hard labor, compounded by his own genetic conditions, had taken their toll. His hands trembled, his frame weakened, the years of isolation, work, and intergenerational disease had worn him down. Martha May remained alone in the hollow for 12 more years. She never remarried, never left the mountains, living in quiet solitude among the reminders of a life filled with relentless loss. Neighbors occasionally left food on the porch, cautious and distant, recognizing her presence as a ghostly figure in the hollow. She existed, breathing, but the life she had once known, the family, the hopes for children, was gone, reduced to memory and cemetery crosses. Dr. Helen Pritchard continued her research on isolated populations and genetic disorders, often reflecting on the Colliers. Martha May had become a living demonstration of the mathematics of genetics, an involuntary case study of inbreeding's relentless consequences. In 1972, Pritchard published a follow-up article tracking the fates of all 10 Collier children, providing empirical evidence of the devastating effects of sustained consanguinity. Her findings were used to advocate for public health interventions, genetic counseling, education about the dangers of cousin marriages, and medical support for families in isolated regions. But for Martha May, these developments came too late. Advances in genetics that could have identified harmful mutations, predicted risks, and provided early interventions existed only in the abstract while she lived and suffered alone in Appalachia. Her story remained a haunting testament. Science, no matter how sophisticated, cannot undo what isolation, tradition, and poverty have already inflicted. Martha May Collier died in February 1979 at 49. A postal worker discovered her body already cold. Autopsy revealed heart failure, though nearly every system bore signs of advanced deterioration, a life worn thin by decades of relentless physical and emotional strain. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the cabin, finally joining her children. 11 crosses now mark the clearing, 11 lives shaped and ended by the unyielding arithmetic of genetics. The cabin itself collapsed over time, swallowed by the mountain that had long isolated the Colliers. The story of Martha May became part of medical education, a cautionary tale used to illustrate the tangible consequences of inbreeding. Textbooks reference the Colliers with clinical detachment, pseudonyms replacing real names, but behind the graphs and statistics lay a woman who had loved, endured, and suffered beyond measure. In the decades since her death, genetic science advanced exponentially. We can now test for mutations, predict compatibility, and intervene medically to save lives at risk from inherited conditions. But for Martha May, these tools came far too late. She lived and died in a world that offered no relief, no understanding, no intervention beyond the rudimentary care of her isolated family. Her life reminds us that genetics is not an abstract discipline, it unfolds in real bodies, in real suffering, in generations trapped by isolation, culture, and circumstance. The tragedy of the Colliers was avoidable, not inevitable, yet it required knowledge, opportunity, and the ability to act that simply did not exist in their hollow. Even today, her story resonates as a warning: science alone cannot prevent tragedy without social structures, education, and access to healthcare reaching those most isolated. Martha May Collier endured a decade of relentless pregnancy, a lifetime of grief, and a mountain of suffering few could imagine. Her body, her children, her life, were living proof of the cruel mathematics of human heredity, compounded by isolation and cultural tradition. After the deaths of her children, Martha May Collier remained a solitary figure in the hollow, a living monument to loss. By the late 1960s, she had aged far beyond her years. Her skin hung in pale folds, hair thin and brittle, eyes deep-set and haunted. The mountain that had once isolated her now seemed to cradle her in silence, a world that had watched and waited while her life unfolded in quiet tragedy. Neighbors occasionally left food on the porch, wary of approaching too closely, as though proximity might summon some intangible danger. They saw her walking slowly through the fog, stooped under the weight of years and grief, a spectral presence among the gnarled trees and rocky soil. Martha May had become part of the hollow itself, a shadow woven into the fog that clung to the ridges, whispering of endurance and sorrow. Dr. Helen Pritchard, still active in her research, often reflected on the Colliers. Martha May's life had become a case study, a cautionary tale, and a testament to the unforgiving arithmetic of genetics compounded by isolation. In 1972, her follow-up publication tracked every one of the Collier children, documenting not just the physical deformities but the patterns of intergenerational inbreeding that had sealed their fates. These reports influenced genetic counseling practices, public health policy, and the study of consanguinity, yet the personal toll, the human suffering, remained raw, unquantifiable, and haunting. Despite the distance of decades and the clinical detachment of science, the story of Martha May's life is vivid, almost unbearable. 10 pregnancies over 10 years, 5 children dead in infancy, 5 living only in states of permanent disability. Each child, each loss, etched into her body and spirit, leaving her hollowed and aged before her time. Thomas Collier, her husband, had died in 1967, leaving her entirely alone. He had endured the labor of the land and the toll of the family's genetic legacy, but his absence left Martha May to navigate the hollow without even the dim support of a partner. From the 1960s onward, she lived quietly. The cabin, once bustling with the desperate activity of care and survival, fell into disrepair. Roof shingles loosened, walls sagged, and eventually, the structure itself began to collapse, returning to the mountain from which it had been carved. The cemetery behind the cabin expanded slightly with each passing year, a collection of wooden crosses marking lives defined by suffering, a small clearing of grief in the endless Appalachian woods. Martha May's own health continued to decline. Years of repeated pregnancy, malnutrition, and stress had left her vulnerable. Bones brittle, teeth largely gone, her uterus prolapsed, her body betrayed her at every turn. She relied on occasional assistance from neighbors, those who had grown up with the echoes of the Colliers' tragedies. Yet, despite her deterioration, she continued to walk the hollow path she had known all her life, moving among the fog and the skeletal remains of the home she had once filled with hope and despair. By the 1970s, her presence in the hollow was ghost-like. Rarely seen, she existed as a quiet reminder of the family's history and the cruel inevitability of genetic isolation. Though medical science had progressed, offering genetic testing, prenatal screening, and the promise of intervention, none of these tools had reached her in time. The lives of her children had already been determined by decades of compounded genetic inheritance, by a family tree twisted back upon itself, roots entangled with branches, the patterns repeating with tragic precision. In February 1979, at the age of 49, Martha May Collier died. A postal worker found her body after several days. She had succumbed to heart failure, though nearly every system in her body bore the marks of chronic deterioration. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the cabin, finally joining her children. 11 wooden crosses now mark the clearing, 10 for her children, 1 for herself, a stark testament to the relentless passage of time, of life and death, and of suffering shaped by both biology and circumstance. The cabin, long abandoned, eventually collapsed entirely. Trees and undergrowth reclaimed the land, as though the mountain itself had absorbed the echoes of grief and endurance. Martha May's story became a fixture in medical education, a grim case study demonstrating the tangible consequences of inbreeding in isolated human populations. Textbooks reference the Colliers clinically, with pseudonyms, diagrams, and statistics, stripping away the personal anguish. But behind the sterile numbers was a woman who had loved fiercely, endured relentlessly, and suffered unimaginably. Her story also became a reminder of what genetic science alone cannot prevent. The consequences of consanguinity, when combined with isolation, poverty, and lack of education, are lived and felt in real bodies, real communities, and real suffering. Martha May Collier's life was shaped by geography, culture, and tradition as much as by the cruel mathematics of heredity. Her children's deaths were not random, they were the product of repeated intermarriage over generations, compounded by environmental deprivation and social isolation. Today, her story remains haunting, a warning woven into the hidden histories of Appalachia. It is a narrative of endurance and heartbreak, of a woman trapped by circumstance, doing everything she could to love and care for children whose lives were predetermined by forces beyond her understanding or control. Advances in genetics might now prevent such tragedies, through education, counseling, and early intervention. But for Martha May, the interventions came decades too late, leaving only the record of her suffering and the stark testimony of the crosses behind her cabin. Martha May's legacy is complex. She was neither villain nor passive victim, she was a woman caught in the merciless intersection of biology and isolation. Her life demonstrates how human love and care can coexist with unavoidable tragedy, how devotion does not always equate to protection, and how circumstance can impose suffering beyond the capacity of a single individual to bear. As the hollow receded into silence, her story endured, captured in medical journals, textbooks, and now retold in the shadows of documentary horror. Her life is a warning, a lesson, and a testament to the consequences of insularity, the necessity of knowledge, and the human cost of generations cut off from broader genetic and social diversity. The fog continues to cling to the hollows, whispering across ridges and valleys, carrying the memory of Martha May Collier and the children she bore. Their story, hidden for decades, reminds us that behind the science are real lives, real suffering, and the enduring weight of human history. It is a story that cannot be erased, a tale that challenges us to confront the consequences of isolation, of ignorance, and of the unyielding patterns of heredity. The story of Martha May Collier does not end with her death or the collapse of the cabin in the Appalachian Hollow. Her life, and the lives of her children, exist as a quiet monument to the consequences of isolation, intermarriage, and generations trapped within a single bloodline. For decades, medical researchers study the Colliers as an example of the concrete, human cost of sustained consanguinity, yet beyond the data and charts, there is a deeper, more haunting truth: Martha May's suffering was never merely academic. It was personal, physical, and relentless. By modern standards, her tragedy could have been mitigated. Today, families in isolated regions can access genetic counseling, prenatal screening, and early interventions that dramatically reduce the risk of severe congenital disorders. Mutations that once passed silently through generations can now be identified and managed before they manifest. Preventive measures, education, and access to healthcare can transform what was once inevitable into something entirely avoidable. But for Martha May, living in mid-20th century Appalachia, none of these tools existed. The mountain hollow offered little knowledge, no outreach, and a culture that valued tradition over adaptation. Her children were not cursed, nor were they punished by divine will. They were the victims of mathematics, the impartial laws of genetics operating over generations of intermarriage. Each pregnancy compounded the risk, each child inheriting a combination of harmful recessive genes that made survival precarious, and growth almost impossible. The human toll was immense. 10 pregnancies over a single decade, 5 children lost to infancy or early childhood, 5 surviving only in states of permanent disability. Martha May's body, taxed to the limit by repeated pregnancy, malnutrition, and emotional strain, became both a cradle and a tomb. Her youth, health, and vitality were consumed, leaving her a shadow of her years by her late 20s. Her husband, Thomas, burdened by the labor of the land and the unrelenting demands of caring for children with severe congenital conditions, succumbed to his own decline at 46. Alone, Martha May survived, living in a hollow filled with ghosts, shadows, and memories, until her own death at 49. Her story also carries a profound lesson about the intersection of genetics, geography, and culture. Isolated populations, particularly those that practice repeated intermarriage, can face compounding genetic risks that manifest across generations. Without external intervention, through education, healthcare access, or social connection, the consequences are not theoretical, they are tangible, visible, and devastating. Martha May's experience illustrates this in the starkest terms possible. The intimate, human cost of genetic isolation is often hidden until tragedy has already struck. The Collier's case was studied extensively. Dr. Helen Pritchard and other researchers documented every detail: deformities, developmental delays, mortality, and the family tree that traced a century of repeated cousin marriages. Their work, published under pseudonyms to protect privacy, became a cornerstone of research into inbreeding depression in humans. The Colliers entered textbooks, their lives distilled into charts, diagrams, and statistical analysis. And yet, behind every data point was a real life, a mother exhausted beyond measure, children trapped in bodies that could not thrive, a family navigating tragedy with no tools or knowledge to change its course. Today, Martha May Collier's story can be understood in both scientific and human terms. Genetically, her family exemplified the risks of accumulated recessive mutations in a closed population. Socially, it highlights the isolation, poverty, and cultural constraints that prevented intervention. Emotionally, it is a story of endurance, love, and devotion in the face of impossible suffering. She loved fiercely, cared relentlessly, and endured what no person should have to bear, yet the circumstances surrounding her life conspired against her, rendering her devotion almost tragically futile. The Appalachian hollow where the Colliers lived has long since reclaimed itself. The cabin collapsed, the cemetery remains weathered, and the fog drifts over ridges and hollows as it always has. But the story persists, not just in journals and textbooks, but in the lessons it imparts. Isolation can amplify tragedy, ignorance can compound risk, and even the deepest love cannot always overcome biology. Martha May's life stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience in the harshest of circumstances. For modern audiences, there is a further resonance. Advances in genetic science, education, and public health have made cases like the Colliers far less likely, but they are not impossible. Understanding the past informs the present. Education and access to care can prevent suffering, yet cultural and social isolation remains a risk factor. Martha May's life reminds us that science, however advanced, cannot reach everyone unless society actively ensures that knowledge, support, and resources are accessible to all communities. And yet, beyond these lessons, there is a human imperative. Martha May Collier deserves to be remembered not as a medical curiosity, not merely as a case study, but as a woman who lived, loved, and endured more than anyone should have to face. Her story asks us to bear witness, to acknowledge suffering even when it seems remote, and to recognize the resilience of those who endure tragedy silently, invisibly, and without hope of reprieve. If you have followed her story to the end, take a moment to honor it. Acknowledge Martha May, the mother, the caregiver, the woman whose life was defined by both unimaginable suffering and extraordinary endurance. Let us remember her not only for the tragedies that befell her children but for the devotion she exhibited despite forces she could neither control nor comprehend. Her story is a warning, a lesson, and a memorial. It underscores the necessity of awareness, of compassion, and of action, medical, social, and cultural, to prevent similar suffering in isolated communities today. But it also leaves us with a haunting, human truth: the lives of Martha May and her children were real, and their suffering was profound. These were not abstractions, not numbers on a page, they were human lives, full of love, endurance, and loss. In remembering Martha May Collier, we acknowledge the invisible struggles endured by those trapped by circumstance, the consequences of isolation, and the power of science and compassion to change lives. Her legacy is both a caution and a call to action, to study, to understand, and, most importantly, to bear witness. For Martha May, the Appalachian mother whose womb became both cradle and tomb, memory is the only justice we can offer.